been very interesting in the last week or so. We have seen not only the then and current Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty, talking about how, well, you know, maybe there's some question marks about some of the policies, particularly the deliberate attempt to scare the British public into staying home for lockdown in March 2020, but also Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, the man making the decisions, who in his new memoirs has questioned whether lockdowns actually worked and did the job. Well, let's talk about this with Will Jones. He's editor at the Daily Sceptic and joins us now. Good afternoon to you, Will.
Good afternoon, Julie. Good to be here.
Lovely to have you join us. Now, of course, the Daily Sceptic started off actually as Lockdown Sceptic, something that an email that I would read every single morning avidly as we were battling against lockdowns. It was one of the few organisations actually speaking out. Indeed, we were the only broadcaster speaking out against lockdowns and policies and querying some of the things which are now accepted as we were on the right side of the facts and of history. What did you make, first of all, of Boris Johnson sort of now querying whether the medieval, as he termed them, lockdowns had really done the job? And as he said, looking at what happened in other countries later on, he said, I don't know how much later on. Actually, if you look at, you know, China with very severe lockdowns, Sweden with just voluntary restrictions and voluntary advice, how actually they still had a second wave and they had pretty much the same outcomes, and that maybe it hadn't worked. What do you make of him saying that in his memoirs?
Well, it's incredible, isn't it? It's good to see Boris catching up with us, those of us who 4 years ago could see straight away that lockdowns were going to be completely catastrophic and ineffective, as indeed our pandemic plan that we'd had prepared for many years said. Of course, that was binned, thrown out by Boris and the scientific advisors in the first weeks of the pandemic in order to adopt this Chinese communist totalitarian policy of lockdown, completely rejected by the plan, and yet here they were putting it into practice. And now Boris, who was always, if we have to be honest, a little bit of a lockdown skeptic, some of the things that have leaked out or come out with the COVID inquiry have shown that he was skeptical at times, but he was, as Ian Duncan Smith said, taken captive by his advisors. But he also, after his illness, after he was hospitalized with COVID, he also became something more of a totalitarian himself, with the lockdowns, a bit of a lockdownist. But it's good to see him coming back to some of his old libertarian ways, and indeed.
I was going to say he talks a good libertarian, but he I mean, I'm not even a libertarian, I'm a liberal, but he isn't. But this thing, I've always felt that the defence of Boris Johnson has always been, oh, but he fought against it. I mean, oh, he was taken captive by his advisors. You know, he had the same abilities you and I had to actually look at some of the facts, to see alternative arguments and debate. And he chose not to, and he chose to go along with things that he thought weren't a good idea because he wanted to do what was popular and not be robust. I've always thought if Margaret Thatcher, for whom at the time I did not hold a candle at the time, but that actually she would have insisted on getting a variety of scientific views in, she'd have been more robust, and she wouldn't have been, as we saw, and this was on a wide scale during the pandemic, middle-aged, overweight men losing their freaking minds with fear about COVID and imposing their fear, their hypochondria, their inability to deal with their own health issues on the rest of us.
Absolutely, and I think we need to say Boris is completely culpable. He was the Prime Minister. He was the man making the decisions. He was in charge. But if I'm going to be fair to him, and I may get in trouble for this, but I'm going to be fair to him, he was surrounded by completely fanatical lockdown advisors, and often left-wing as well. I mean, look at Patrick Vallance, now ennobled as a Labour science minister in the Lords. So he was surrounded, and it's not like in Sweden where the advisors themselves were completely clear and firm that they were going to stick with the plan, the pandemic plan that did not involve lockdowns, the rejected lockdowns. They stuck with that.
And even when it was unpopular, even when the public were going, are you sure about this? Because people are dying.
Absolutely, and they stuck with it, and because of that, Sweden was able to stick with it. I think Boris, if I'm going to be fair to him, and I do feel guilty about being fair to Boris, because, you know, but if I'm going to be fair to him, he was surrounded by people. It would have been very, very hard, I think, for him to have gone, you know what, I'm going to ignore what my science advisor, minister is saying, chief scientist is saying, what my chief medical officer is saying, I'm just going to go against it. However, in the end, he was the decision maker. The evidence and the facts were there, and he should have been able to find other advisors, to listen to other people, and to be able to say, no, we're going to stick with the plan.
Exactly. And there was an incredible amount of groupthink wasn't going on there. This is the thing, because I did support the first lockdown only once it was brought in, because and this is foolish, and I'll never make this mistake again, I assumed because Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance had actually been on the podium, they've been in, if you go back and look at the press conferences they gave in early March, they were very clear. The reason why you don't lock down, when the Labour Party and the trade unions, the education unions were demanding this. The media, oh my God, Sky and the BBC were clamouring for a lockdown day after day. They were the ones saying, no, they won't actually save lives, and the argument for the first lockdown was simply to flatten the curve. We haven't got the NHS ready. We need to reduce demand, but then we'll come out after 3 weeks. But the reality was, I assumed that they'd been given new advice. I assumed they had new facts, and that was why they changed their plan. And they literally did it on a turn of a sixpence. But it turns out they didn't. This was just Dominic Cummings seeing this ridiculous Neil Ferguson computer model, and again losing his mind. And then suddenly we were locking down. And this is the thing that's come out largely from Matt Hancock's WhatsApps rather than from the COVID inquiry, is just how chaotic, unthought through, no cost-benefit analysis, no real long-term planning, no real scientific backup for virtually every single policy that we had, whether it was the tiers, could you have a Scotch egg or having a pint, could you stand up, could you sit down, could kids be back in schools, were they wearing masks, in a corridor, or were they in the classroom? Virtually all of it was made up on the spot, pandering to a scared media and a scared public, rather than based on what they laughably called the science.
I think there was more to it than that. There was definitely that going on, a massive clamour from the public who were being led astray by the media and by others. But there was also a global movement behind the scenes. There was propaganda going out from China. There were people going off to China. The World Health Organization sent a delegation who came back in February saying, oh, yes, Wuhan, they've beaten it back with this lockdown. The World Health Organization literally said countries need to copy China. So there was a massive movement going on behind the scenes. Dominic Cummings has said that Bill Gates type people were getting in touch with Downing Street and telling them, you need to do this. This is the new way of doing it. So there was behind the scenes a massive, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there is clear evidence. There was a massive push behind the scenes from the lockdownists who've been pushing this for years, for decades. It's been a movement that the politicians wisely ignored and didn't make it into our pandemic plan, but it's been there in the background. And unfortunately, this was their moment, and they grabbed it with both hands. And it wasn't just China, but it came partly out of China and partly out of people like Neil Ferguson, Imperial College, and a whole industry of pandemic preparedness that was pushing this direction. And they're still pushing this.
Oh, they're still doing it now. But again, what I find fascinating is that, if you were talking about how, for instance, how COVID had come from the Wuhan lab, you were a conspiracy theorist in 2020, 2021. Suddenly, no longer a conspiracy theorist. Even the Prime Minister, even Joe Biden, as US President, is allowed to say it. Suddenly it's then not a conspiracy theory. It's quite extraordinary. Will Jones, we'll have to leave it there. Really appreciate you joining us. Appreciate your fantastic work there at the Daily Sceptic. You don't have to agree with everything someone says, but hey, why does it challenge people to hear things that they disagree with? Editor at the Daily Sceptic, Will Jones.